I happen to have the good fortune of being a good friend, I hope, of our speaker today, R.J. Pestritto, Dr. Pestritto. I've known him for a couple of decades out in Claremont, where he did his studies. And I can say about R.J. that Dr. Pestritto to you, that he has studied with some of the best minds in the country, I think, and has managed himself, I think, over the years to become one of them. So we're very fortunate to have him here today. He is graduate dean and associate professor of politics at Hillsdale College in Michigan. He is a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy. And as your flyer will tell you, he's the author and editor of several books and many articles. Most of his scholarship, most of his books and articles have been on the subject of American political thought, in particular on the subject of progressivism and Woodrow Wilson. And his topic this afternoon is Progressivism and Religion, Social Gospel, and the Origins of Modern Liberalism. So please join me in welcoming Dr. R.J. Pestritto.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I appreciate that introduction. Let me see if I can lower this a little bit. Okay. Thanks also to Dan Palm, Dr. Palm, and the political science faculty for asking me here this afternoon and to lecture in this prestigious program. And I look forward to talking to some of the students here after we're through. It's a treat, really, for me to be here at APU. This was the first place. It's a place where I first walked into a college classroom as a professor. So I don't want to think about how long ago that was exactly, but it was a long time ago. It was long enough ago that Dr. Weeks was still chairman of political science at that time. And in fact, I should say I'm very thankful to Dr. Weeks for really helping me get started in my teaching career. I was still finishing my PhD and had zero teaching experience, and there's certainly a steep learning curve for first-time professors, and he was the model of patience and support at that time, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that had he not been, I might be doing something different these days, so I'm very, very grateful. And I've known Dr. Flannery as well for quite some time and learned some things from him as well. It might be best if I don't publicize those, but we can talk about that later. So, just kidding. But the bottom line is that this is a university for which I have tremendous respect, and I know very well what the standards are here for students in this program. I know the quality of what goes on in the classroom, and I think you all are very fortunate. And it's probably something I don't need to tell you. As I said, I went to graduate school down the road from here in Claremont, and I now find myself in the position of running our own graduate program at Hillsdale. It's a program based on the core texts of the Western and American traditions of political thought. It's one I think would be very compatible with folks who are educated in the way that you all are here. So I've left some propaganda, or literature, I should say, and you're welcome to take that or to speak with me afterwards. I'd be happy to answer whatever questions you might have. And I'm pleased that the faculty and I really got so lucky with the topic that we chose for this afternoon's lecture. I gave them a couple of options back when we were planning this, and I think they must have the gift of foresight in choosing and in settling on the topic of religion and politics, because, of course, for anyone who hasn't been living under a rock for the last couple or few weeks, you may have noticed that this is a question that's come to occupy the center of kind of the public square at a time when we all thought this election cycle that we're in now would be very much about the economy. So it really has been fortuitous for us, and I really can't remember the last time that I saw so much attention in the public press on the question of the First Amendment and religious liberty. If you open up the pages of the Wall Street Journal editorial page, for instance, you saw the entire page covered with letters about religious liberty over the last few days. So it really It's been quite remarkable. And I'm referring, of course, to the Obama administration's rule, which has since been slightly revised, mandating that employers, even religious employers, provide for medical services that may, in fact, violate their creeds. And so many commentators, many politicians, and by the way, not all of them on the conservative side of the political spectrum, have declared that the Obama administration is waging war against religion in this country. So it has led many to consider the question of whether or not our progressives today are in fact the enemies of religious faith. Right? There's been a lot of contentious debate about this recently. Now, I'm not going to wade exactly into that question, about which I assume there are numerous and varied opinions. But since I claim to know something not so much about the progressives today, but about their ancestors in the original progressive movement, it seems like the time is ripe to investigate the relationship between the foundational principles of modern liberalism and religious faith. And so that's what I'm going to try to do this afternoon. Progressivism itself has, of course, become politically relevant in the last few years. And back in the good old days when there were just a few of us who were toiling away doing research on this question, it really would have seemed laughable to suggest that you would have lectures and conferences and books on progressivism all over the place. You'd see someone like myself with his mug on national television on a semi-regular basis, which is as frightening for me as it was for those watching it, I'm sure. Progressivism has become a term with which that many on the left today especially have chosen to identify themselves. And many of them claim America's original progressives, many on the left do, as the originators, as their ancestors, as the foundation for their own political principles. Since some today attack our contemporary progressives as anti-religious, it seemed reasonable to ask if the original progressives relied on anti-religious themes, anti-religious arguments to promote their ideology. After all, some conservatives assume that any bad or dangerous political ideology must be accompanied by some kind of atheism or anti-religious zealotry. But in the case of progressivism, at least the original progressive movement, while there certainly were some figures who were overtly hostile to religion, one thinks, for example, of Herbert Crowley, whose parents baptized him into something called the Church of Humanity, which was dedicated to the atheistic Church of Humanity dedicated to the positivism of Auguste Comte. Crowley was influential in the founding of the New Republic, among other things. But aside from Crowley and a few others like that, as a whole, the progressive movement was profoundly bound up with religious belief. And many in the progressive movement were driven by a sincere and a fervent Christianity. Let me read a speech here, or an excerpt from a speech, I should say, that was made by a presidential nominee back in the progressive era, one that someone, I suppose, like Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell or someone on the so-called religious right could easily have given today. Goes something like this, or went something like this. Our cause is based on the eternal principle of righteousness, and even though we who now lead may for the time fail, in the end the cause itself shall triumph. We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord. Does anyone recognize that speech? Professors aren't allowed to answer. It's the speech given by Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 when he accepted the Progressive Party's nomination for presidency. That's when he was making his third-party run for the presidency. That convention, as many of you may know, culminated in the party faithful marching around the convention hall, waving Bibles to and singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers." Right? It's a political convention. And in fact, it really was more a church revival than a political meeting in many ways. Another example, for the great populist, William Jennings Bryan, progressivism was a way to advance evangelical Christianity. It was Bryan, of course, who famously proclaimed, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Right? That was from his speech to the Democratic National Convention in 1896. And it shows how those who were allied in one way or another with the progressive cause very often used religious imagery to make their arguments. And you know, using religious imagery even to speak to a topic as mundane as the gold standard. Right? I mean, it's not something that you would normally associate with something as animated as Bryan made it. So there was a good deal of religious fervor then in the latter part of the 19th century. And some of it, without doubt, was a holdover or grew out of the seeds of certain movements from the antebellum period, seeds of things like abolitionism and other social movements, temperance, for instance. But social gospel was really more than that. Social gospel was not simply a kind of more socially conscious version of these earlier phenomena. In fact, at its core, social gospel was really quite radical. In many ways, even more radical than sort of progressivism itself. Although I think I ultimately want to argue that they mostly overlapped. Beginning in the 1880s and going up through at least the First World War, what the social gospel movement was essentially the response of liberal evangelical Protestantism to the great cultural and intellectual developments and upheavals of the mid-19th century, and especially, of course, to the doctrine of evolution. And in response to that, I mean, the Protestant church basically responded in two very distinct ways to that development. On the one hand, you had the Orthodox response. And the Orthodox response, generally speaking, was to oppose the new evolutionary science as godless, as anti-religious, and to consequently to reassert the fundamentals of the Orthodox faith. In fact, this is where the term, as many of you probably know, this is where the term fundamentalist comes from. Right? Orthodox Protestants took their cue at this time from a widespread circulation of a series of books or pamphlets which were called the Fundamentals. And they emphasized the key teachings of the faith, the infallibility of the Bible, the literal meaning of the Bible, and among other things. Social gospel adherents, however, had a very different reaction to the developments of the mid-19th century. They believed that the bulwarks of the Orthodox Church, its conservative doctrines, its strict moral teachings, that these things were the Church's greatest weakness. They believed that Orthodox religion was insufficient for the times, that it was proving a barrier to reforms that they thought were being made necessary by new social and economic conditions going on in the country during their day. Specifically, the social gospelers questioned the literal inspiration of the Bible. Just an example of the skepticism can be found in Washington Gladden's book. Washington Gladden is a very important member of the social gospel movement. A book he wrote in 1891 called Who Wrote the Bible? It questioned the historicity of the Christ of the Gospels. It stressed ethical behavior as opposed to formal doctrinal creeds. Social gospelers also saw not a threat in evolution, but great promise in the theory of evolution. They believed that the theory opened up new possibilities for Christian social action with its notion of endless positive change. Now, this isn't to suggest that social gospel adherents took their Darwinism unvarnished or unadulterated. They rejected, for instance, the harsh, deterministic kind of right-wing social Darwinism of folks like Herbert Spencer or William Graham Sumner, sort of the survival of the fittest twist on Darwinism. Instead, the social gospel movement took evolution, adapted it for a religious message, and posited evolution as a kind of divine plan for rational social advancement. And it's for this reason that social gospel is occasionally, and it seems to me probably correctly, understood as a fusion of liberal Protestantism and Hegelianism. In fact, as I've argued elsewhere, as others have argued elsewhere, the progressive movement itself as a whole imported the principles of the philosophy of history, the principles of the rational end state into America from the German tradition of thought. And this was a tradition of thought that was informed above all by the philosopher Georg Hegel. Hegel's thought, which certainly had dominated Germany for most of the 19th century, it contended essentially that history was not simply a record of random events, not simply a story of things that had happened in the past, a record of things that had happened in the past, but was instead a rational force, a positive force used by God to bring about a perfected kind of state here on earth. In that perfected state, which Hegel loosely associated with his own Prussian regime, very loosely associated with it, the idea was that God himself was made present in the state's institutions, in its laws, in its policies. Hegel, in fact, in his book, The Philosophy of History, called the state the divine idea as it exists on earth. And he therefore encouraged the complete devotion of each citizen to the state, because in the state God had become eminentized. Right? God was made present. God was brought down from the heavens and manifested in the state. American progressives were in general very taken with that argument. They liked the idea about the forward progress of history, and it became for progressives the means by which they argued that historical progress had made the Constitution's original limits on the national state outdated and unjust. For the social gospelers within the progressive movement, essentially one's Christian identity became fused with one's devotion to the social enterprises of the modern state. Now, how did this influence come to be? Hegelianism, philosophy of history, grew to this level of influence in America due, I think, in large measure to the sea change which had taken place in American higher education in the second half of the 19th century, say between 1860 and 1900. Most intellectuals who wanted a higher degree went to Europe to get it and often went to Germany to get it. And so therefore a German educational pedigree became kind of the trendy thing for American colleges when they went about hiring faculty during this time. This is one of the ways in which otherwise orthodox colleges with orthodox boards of trustees were sort of became very progressive because they, even though the boards of trustees remained orthodox and they retained traditional religious missions, what you wanted to do to be a prestige place was to get yourself some of these European-trained PhDs. And so it was this way that a great transformation took place. And in fact, as some of you may know, Johns Hopkins University was founded in 1876 for the explicit purpose of bringing the German educational model to the United States. And it's certainly no coincidence, by the way, that from Hopkins, the careers of many prominent progressives were launched. Woodrow Wilson, John Dewey, Frederick Jackson Turner, just to name a few of the most famous. The Hopkins faculty was populated with German-educated professors, among the most prominent of whom was Richard T. Ely. Ely was easily the most important economic thinker of the social gospel movement, and he was a teacher of Woodrow Wilson and of Frederick Jackson Turner. Ely began his higher education at Dartmouth and at Columbia, and then he took a 3-year fellowship to go to Germany to study at Heidelberg, which is where he got his PhD. And he got his PhD there. He brought back with him to the United States new methods of thinking, new methods of research, and by the end of the 19th century, Ely had become certainly the best-known advocate of social Christianity in America, and I don't think it's much of a stretch to say he was essentially a household name. In addition to championing the New School of Economics when he returned from Germany, which I won't get into here, he applied the German model to theology. And the implications of this application are seen in Ely's influential book, written in 1899, or published in 1899, I should say, called Social Aspects of Christianity. Now, in that book, Ely thought that the Christian church had become too otherworldly, that it was preoccupied with theology and with doctrine, and it did so at the expense of neglecting the abolition of poverty, which he believes should be the distinct aim of biblical social ethics. The idea was we have to establish a general social welfare. That's the mandate of the Christian faith. As he wrote in this book, Christianity ought to be primarily concerned with this world, And Ely said its mission ought to be, quote, to bring to pass here a kingdom of righteousness and to rescue from the evil one and redeem all our social relations. So if Ely had been responsible for infusing social gospel with new economics, then it was the Baptist preacher Walter Rauschenbusch who was the most important clergyman and theologian of the movement. Rauschenbusch's ministry, and I think some of the Koch fellows were given some enlightening readings from Rauschenbusch. I hope they were enlightening anyways. But Rauschenbusch's ministry began in the Hell's Kitchen area of New York back in the mid-1880s. And as you can imagine, someone who would have been there at that time would have encountered, of course, the harshest conditions of poverty, crime, disease, malnutrition, every sort of social malady you can imagine. And it very much proved to be a defining period for Rauschenbusch, who later wrote in his 1912 book, Christianizing the Social Order, that America's social order had to undergo, sorry, I lost my place here. Yeah, he said it had to undergo a revolution, and that this revolution would require a fundamental rethinking and a reordering of the capitalist economic system. Now, if you think about capitalism, Rauschenbusch argued, capitalism seeks unearned profits by exploiting labor through low wages and through poor working conditions. So if we're going to solve that problem, the only thing we can do is to attack it at its root. The root of that is the unequal distribution of wealth. We can get at the unequal distribution of wealth by democratizing, what he called democratizing the rights of property. How do we democratize the rights of property? We institute public ownership of essential industries, and we do what Ely called, or we engage in what Ely called cooperative ownership of other businesses. Like Ely, Rauschenbusch called for democratic Christian socialism, which he said would be a mechanism for achieving the kingdom of God here on earth through the enterprise of the state. Well, if this were going to happen, we would have to rethink traditional Christian teachings. And Rauschenbusch, for one, acknowledged that. The old theology, Rauschenbusch explained, focused on original sin. it focused on the permanently fallen nature of man. The idea was that through original sin, because of man's fallen nature, it can only be overcome by grace. This grace is offered in the Gospels. It's ministered by the church. The object of the old theology, of course, was the next life. The point was to save individual souls for that next life. And thus the role of the church was to provide doctrinal propositions and doctrinal prescriptions for that individual salvation. So this old idea of original sin, right, the idea that man's nature, again, is permanently fallen, this was the bedrock of the traditional Christian faith. The social gospelers knew this, and they knew that it was a problem. It was a problem because with man's nature permanently fallen, if you say that his nature is permanently fallen, then that means paradise cannot be attained in this life. Human life and human works, including human government, would have to be limited, would have to be circumscribed, and we would have to concede that they were incapable of perfection. This older limited view of man, this limited view of the earthly life, was the backbone of what Rauschenbusch called otherworldly religion. Otherworldly religion. And he's got a passage on this in his book. It says the following. He says, otherworldly religion was the full expression of the highest aspirations of ancient and medieval life. Contemporary philosophy supported it. The Ptolemaic astronomy made it easy to conceive of a heaven localized about the starry firmament, which was only a few miles up. But today, the whole Weltanschauung, which supported those religious conceptions, has melted away irretrievably. Copernican astronomy, the conviction of the universal and majestic reign of law, the evolutionary conception of the history of this earth and of the race, have made the religious ideas that were the natural denizens of the old world of thought seem like antique survivals today, as if a company of Athenians should walk down Broadway in their ancient dress. So instead of the old otherworldly religion based on original sin, based on the limits of man's fallen nature, the theory of evolution offered promise. It promised man's improvement and even man's perfection here in this earthly life. So man no longer had to wait for the next life in order to achieve a kind of paradise. Evolution offered the promise that he could achieve it here in this life and could do so through the social activities of the modern state. So the new theological interpretations were forwarded to support this new turn. The harshness of the Old Testament became tempered with a kind of optimism, just as the sharpness of God's judgments came to be smoothed and softened by the idea of progress. Evil, the argument went, does not stem from the devil's temptations or from the weaknesses of the flesh, but rather evil is caused by the lure of a new malady in modern society. The new grave sins were not so much individual acts, but social acts, such as organizing to defeat tenement legislation, organizing to defeat factory legislation, things like preventing the improvement of the condition of laborers or encouraging war to generate profit. Rauschenbusch also explained that Orthodox religion was what he called too individualized. Too individualized. And what he meant by that was that it focused too much on the salvation of the individual soul for the next life and not enough on social acts in this life. And so in this religious individualism, as Rauschenbusch called it, he said, quote, "There was a subtle twist of self-seeking which vitiated its Christ-likeness. Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ and Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress are classical expressions of personal religion, the one Roman Catholic and monastic, the other Protestant and Puritan. In both, piety is self-centered. In both, we are taught to seek the highest good of the soul by turning away from the world of men. So this focus on salvation in the next life, on the permanent limits of man's nature in this life, this was a tremendous obstacle for someone like Rauschenbusch. It was an obstacle to man giving himself entirely to the social enterprises of the state here on earth. So it had to be overturned if the state was to become the means of bringing about a kind of heaven on earth, a kind of paradise on earth. In this new understanding, then salvation comes from serving the worldly social good and obtaining a kind of secular heaven. Sinfulness occurs when man seeks to establish a private kingdom, when he focuses on his own otherworldly reward or punishment, as the case may be, when he fails to work for the progress of all mankind. Now, social gospel, as I've said, was very much intertwined with its cousin, progressivism, and we should consider here for a moment how this theological argument, because after all, I actually don't know much about theology. I claim to know something about politics. So I want to talk about how this theological argument in social gospel has a parallel argument within the political philosophy of progressivism. Okay, social gospel, as we've said, the problem with the old order is what? Is that it's got a static view of man. That because of original sin, man's nature is fallen, and thus paradise is never possible here in this life. Think about the political view that dominated the American founding. And think about it as represented especially by James Madison in the 10th Federalist Paper. Madison wrote in Federalist 10 that, quote, "the permanent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man." All right? In other words, the whole original model of American government, at least as the Federalists understood it, was predicated on a certain conception of human nature. Right? Publius writes in the Federalist, what is government other than a reflection on human nature? And this conception of human nature asserted that man, while certainly capable of reason and therefore of self-government, would always also be prone to self-interestedness. He'd be prone to abusing power to advantage himself at the expense of others. And this was permanently the case with human nature. If you know the Federalist, you know in number 6, Publius pokes fun at anyone who sees progress in human nature on this question, right? And so the Federalists thought that it was folly to conceive of government as perfectible, or to think that human government could ever be capable of solving all human problems, right? And you know the argument of the Federalist, you know that examples are given always both ancient and modern, as if to underscore the permanent nature of man. Now, bearing in mind then this permanent fallen nature, our founders designed a system of limited government. Right? First have to enable the government to control the governed, then enable it to control itself. Right? That's from the Federalist. And so we have the system of limited government based on Madison's warning in Federalist 51 that men, in this life at least, would never be angelic. And so just as social gospel then hoped for the perfection of human life here on earth and thus urged a new devotion to a vastly empowered central state, so too in the progressive era critique of founding era constitutionalism, we see the argument that history had in fact solved the problem of faction, that the Federalists were wrong that factiousness was permanently a part of human nature. The progressives argued instead that man's nature was no longer a danger to itself, and thus the restrictions put on human government could be removed for the purposes of achieving a fully just political order, that history had solved that problem of faction. And so there's a very close relationship in the way that these two movements conceive of human nature and in what that enables us to do with human government as a consequence of that. Now, as a practical matter, then, what did social gospel theology call for? when it contemplated the devotion of the individual to social action and to the common enterprises of the state. Well, principally it called for the dismantling of the system of capitalism. Right? And such a dismantling would, as Rauschenbusch freely admitted, require a dismantling of the private rights of property and turning private property into a resource for social use. When speaking of all the new activity that would be required of the central government under his vision of social Christianity, Rauschenbusch stated the problem and its solution quite succinctly in his book, Christianizing the Social Order. He said the following, quote, "Where is the money to come from for all of these new expenditures?" Right? So this is it's been a problem for a long time, right? Where is the money to come from for all these expenditures? Well, there is plenty of property, but it is not available for social purposes. So if we want to conserve life, we shall have to re-socialize property. Okay. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to re-socialize property? Rauschenbusch explained. He says, quote, "By socializing property, we mean then that it is made to serve the public good, either by the service its uses render to the public welfare, or by the income it brings to the public treasury. Socializing property will mean, therefore, that instead of serving the welfare of a small group directly and the public welfare only indirectly, it will be made more directly available for the service of all." So if one were to ask, well, what about the protections for individual property rights, which of course the original constitutional limitations on government were principally designed to protect? Rauschenbusch would agree that the original understanding of rights was a problem, and thus he argued it would have to be undone. He complained that, quote, "the plain path of justice and good sense is blocked by the property rights brought down from a different past. And so property rights will have to be re-socialized to bring them into accordance with our actual moral relations." So this idea of government dedicated to securing the rights of the individual has to give way to the dedication that all must have to the enterprises of the state in Rauschenbusch's social Christianity. He explains the following, again from Christianizing the Social Order. "The whole institution of private property exists because it is for the public good that it shall exist. If in any particular it becomes dangerous to the public welfare, it must cease. Salus republicae summa lex, the good of the republic is the highest law." Now, all this may sound rather radical. It may be asked what relation it has to mainstream progressivism. But in fact, I think it's fair to say there's little in what I have described here from social gospel that did not apply to the political ideology of most progressives. And I'll try to show that by concluding my remarks here briefly by talking about Theodore Roosevelt, pointing to his example. And I choose TR here for a couple of reasons. First, he's of course about as prominent and a mainstream progressive as you can find. And second, President Obama himself has just recently gone out of his way to connect his own vision of economic justice to TR's. Some of you may recall that just a couple of months ago, the president made a special trip to Osawatomie, Kansas. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Is there anyone from Osawatomie here? To Osawatomie, Kansas. Well, what's significant about that site, of course, was the site of the famous New Nationalism speech that Teddy Roosevelt gave in 1910. That's where he had sort of gone on safari after he left the presidency, came back. He'd actually come under the influence of Herbert Crowley's Promise of the American Life, which he'd read while away. He comes back, doesn't like what he sees in Taft, and he decides to kind of launch this campaign to kind of retake things. And his New Nationalism speech in 1910 became the foundation for his run to regain the presidency in 1912. So that's where President Obama went just a couple months ago to lay out his own vision of economic justice. And the parallels between the arguments that President Obama made in Osawatomie for a kind of economic populism, right? Sort of based on the idea that we have wealthy special interests, they're not paying their fair share. Those arguments can almost be taken word for word from TR's original New Nationalism speech, which he gave at the same location in 1910. And to focus just on one thing here for the purpose of making the point, we know, for instance, that Roosevelt detested the judiciary and that he frequently railed against the courts of his day because the courts, both state and federal, were often overturning progressive legislation. And this is the so-called Lochner era of the court, which I'm sure your professors have educated you about. But it was an era where courts were often sort of defeating or undoing some of the progressive legislative victories, especially ones that they had won at the state level. So you had court decisions overturning a lot of labor regulations, child labor laws, things of that nature. So Roosevelt, in attacking the courts, and in attacking the courts for essentially upholding or for striking down this legislation on the basis of the old idea of property rights, he said, you know, property rights are the last defense of the special interests. The last defense of the special interests. And these special interests put forth their own individual advantage at the expense of the common good. Now, he acknowledged that the American system of government had been designed with just such a protection of private property in mind. He acknowledged this, and he says, therefore, we have to, quote, change the rules of the game. So just as Rauschenbusch had called for resocializing property in order to make it reflect the new social condition of man that had been brought about by history, Teddy Roosevelt subscribed to the progressive redefinition of property rights. So he argued that one's right to property did not come as it had for the 18th century liberalism that influenced the founders, did not come through an account of nature, where individual labor gives title to property, right? We know this from Locke's second treatise, among other places. Rather, according to Roosevelt, one had a right to property only insofar as it was socially beneficial for one to have it. So title to property then doesn't come from individual labor. Title to property is contingent upon its serving a social purpose. So in this famous New Nationalism speech that I was mentioning just a moment ago, Roosevelt explained the following, quote, "We grudge no man a fortune which represents his own power and sagacity when exercised with entire regard to the welfare of his fellows." So property rights were no longer to be moored in nature. They were no longer to be used as a kind of trump against social action, a kind of line over which the state could not cross at will. They were instead to be determined by social expediency. Now, Roosevelt was explicit about the contingency of property rights on social utility, and also about the new and increased scope of state power which would correspond with such a conception of property rights. He wrote the following, "We grudge no man a fortune in civil life if it is honorably obtained and well used." And well used. It is not even enough that it should have been gained without doing damage to the community. In other words, it's not, you know, if you can say, well, look, I didn't steal from anybody, I was honest, I worked hard, I earned it. He says, yeah, that's necessary, but that's not sufficient. He went on, quote, "We should permit it to be gained. We should permit it to be gained only so long as the gaining represents benefit to the community. This, I know, implies a policy of far more active governmental interference with social and economic conditions in this country than we have yet had. But I think we've got to face the fact that such an increase in governmental control is now necessary." So Roosevelt, of course, was conscious that his vision for equalizing rewards, which he called it, and in other terms, the square deal, that this was not compatible with the original American conception of property rights, that it was instead founded upon a new theory. And he said squarely, quote, "We are face to face with the new conceptions of the relations of property to human welfare." He proclaimed that just in the way, of course, that Rauschenbusch had contended that property rights had to be brought, quote, into accordance with our actual moral relations. So in justifying this move from the old conception to the new conception, Roosevelt offered a construction where property rights stood in opposition to human rights. If you read a lot of his speeches at this time, this is the construction that you get. Property rights versus human rights. Property, therefore, of course, is not an extension of the human person, right? We know this sort of traditional 18th century view. Again, you mix your labor with property, you make it your own, it gives you title to it, right? It's an extension of your person. So property, one might say, is a fundamental human right from the point of view of the founding generation. Whereas for Roosevelt, you've got human rights on one side, property rights on the other side. He said that what property does now is to serve to alienate man from his own welfare. And we've been brought to this point, he concluded, quote, because certain advocates of the rights of property as against the rights of men have been pushing their claims too far. Right? So rights of property versus the rights of men. So the point of this is to say that for both social gospel and for progressivism generally, the evolutionary power of history had brought about a sea change in what was possible, right? Both in human nature and in human government. And thus the power of the state, all of what was going on in the 19th century provided new possibilities for the power of the state in the 20th century. The power of the state was looked upon now optimistically. And really what I want to suggest by my remarks, and to wind it up here, is that optimism came as much from, if not more from, religion as it did from political philosophy. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much. You've been patient.
You mentioned President Obama's very explicit and emphatic identification of his own progressivism with Teddy Roosevelt's progressivism at that place whose pronunciation I, too, am very interested in finding out. I always thought it was Osawatomie, but well, I don't know.
You could be right. Yeah.
So it's clear that he is very conscious of and wants to emphasize his indebtedness to the political legacy of progressivism. Yeah. I wonder what you think, or how much you think he is thoughtful about, or thinks, or conscious of a philosophical indebtedness to that, and religious as well.
Yeah, the religious side of it is, I mean, to me, is the most interesting because, in 2008, then Senator Obama, very much, wanted to kind of tap into the social justice left, for as well I'll call it, for lack of a better term. And you remember he gave the speech on religion and politics, and sort of very, it was understood that a successful Democratic candidate was going to need to tap into this because several previous elections, faith voters, value voters, whatever you want to call them, had very much been the province of the Republican Party. And so there was a conscious effort and very much a successful effort, or at least successful enough, to tap into the sort of social justice left. This is what I think has made the recent ruling with the Health and Human Services, the contraception and abortifacients and all of that. I think it's a huge mistake. I mean, tactically. I mean, never leave aside what you think about the sort of principle of the thing. Just tactically, it's mystifying. And you can see many of the president's allies on the left, from the so-called social justice left. Again, I don't even know if that's a term that makes any sense, but I'll use it. you see these people very disappointed and almost incredulous. I mean, maybe one of the best examples of this is E.J. Dionne, who's basically a very sympathetic columnist, from the Post, the Obama administration. Just basically, hey, we folks on the left who are people of faith feel like we now have been hung out to dry because we've sort of been carrying the water for you. And so it seems to me that the president has very consciously been trying to understand as one source of his progressivism this faith tradition. But the latest events call that into question. I mean, who knows? I'm a useless political prognosticator, but I think it will hurt badly. In terms of campaign politics, at least. So, yes, ma'am.
How would you compare the church's reaction to Rauschenbusch with the modern church's reaction to the more modern liberals and progressives?
Well, I mean, it's, I guess partly, what do you mean by church exactly?
Like the Christian,
yeah.
The more conservative Christians as compared to the conservative Christians of Rauschenbusch's day.
Well, I mean, it is, there is, there's a very, and certainly in the Protestant church, there's a very strong reaction to social gospel, or at least to evolution, what eventually, comes to infuse itself in social gospel. That, as I say, that's where the reassertion of fundamentals comes from in our history. Today, I think also you have a pretty bifurcated or a pretty polarized reaction. You have, as I say, folks on the left, religious folks on the left, who have wanted to find ways to embrace the president, who've wanted to find ways to embrace Obamacare, for example, and to whom this was a kind of betrayal, and many of whom have been satisfied with the accommodation that was made. And the reaction on the right, and again, it's a reaction that has transcended traditional sectarian divide, right? So it's Protestants of a certain kind, Catholics, Jews, all of that, all of them are on the other side. And so there's a tremendous, it seems to me, polarization, and it reflects the tremendous polarization generally in the country today. You can call it red versus blue, I don't know, but I think the country is more divided at a fundamental level than at any time since the Civil War. And that's frightening. So.
Thank you.
Hi. Were we in class together?
We were.
Okay.
This is going way back,
okay.
But Dr. Pestritto and I had our very first PhD class together way back when, and I won't tell you the year.
Right. Thank you.
We both are probably looking a little older these days, but good to see you.
Yeah.
I'm asking this on behalf of my students who I just tortured yesterday in our con law midterm. To what degree would you say that the Kelo versus City of New London decision represented kind of that Roosevelt ideal of categorizing private property as being really only a value unless it produces social benefit? Yeah.
No, that's a good question. And it's funny. I mean, I think in a different way, the Obamacare case is going to be heard this spring here, I guess next month. And I think the reaction to it, whatever it is, may be as intense as the reaction to Kelo. It's funny. The Kelo case, to my mind, was sort of strange because of the if I'm getting the particular justices wrong, you'll correct me. But Justice O'Connor, I believe, wrote the dissent in the Kelo case, or a dissent in the Kelo case. And I was mystified by her dissent because, of course, she had, I believe, either written the majority or been in the majority for the Midkiff v. Hawaii case. Okay. And that was where, I won't go into bore you with the details of the case, but that was a case where essentially the takings clause, where it says if you take private property, it sort of suggests that the government can take private property. You got the so-called public purpose doctrine, that private property can be taken not just for public use, but to forward any public purpose. And the Kelo case it seems to me a perfectly logical and sensible outgrowth from the logic of the Midkiff case. And it's, you know, I hadn't thought about the connection at all, but it is, you know, the language is remarkably similar. The idea of you know, property is there to serve a public purpose. Now, of course, it is true that you know, I don't want to give sort of an overly libertarian, I guess, a view of things. I mean, you do have to understand property rights within the whole context of, you know, the ends of Republican government, and so they're not absolute in every respect. But the level of public use here that's suggested, I think, is very much along the lines of sort of the Kelo and the Midkiff I would throw in there. So, yeah.
Your discussion focused mostly on social gospel theology, and I was just wondering where you would include in the history of progressivism in this country like theologies such as liberation theology, and also the beliefs of churches that are much older, like the Quakers and the Brethren Church, who believe that social justice is a function of the church against a corrupt state.
Yeah. No, there's a long tradition of that, and I mean, I know enough about it to be dangerous, by the way, just enough to be dangerous. You know, liberation, I mean, is something I associate more with the Catholic Church, and it's my own church. I know something more about it, and it comes, you know, it actually comes later. The reaction in the Protestant church, you sort of get that divide there between the social gospelers and the fundamentalists. But really, the divide among Catholics comes a little bit later in the 20th century. Do you want to follow that up, or?
Well, okay. So, what about also like with like churches that are older, though, such as like the Brethren, and functions of those churches who believed that that was in fact the function of the church? Yeah,
I mean, honestly, I don't know enough to say about the history of those churches. It is. I should be clear, though, that I'm not, because part of what you can ask, based on what I'm suggesting, is when Christianity is taken in the direction that social gospel takes it, is it taken in a direction that is a kind of sort of logical offshoot, or is the kind of Christianity that you get so different from what it came out of that it's something different? And that's, I probably didn't state that very articulately, but if you take the doctrine of original sin and you take it out of Christianity, what do you have left, right? I mean, that's a question one could ask. So the you know, in sort of response to your question, what I want to suggest is that there's something pretty radical here that's being transformed in the Christian faith, but it's not because there had not been a tradition in Christianity of social justice or being socially responsible, or, you know, which of course goes back to the gospel. But the question is, you know, is the way in which the faith became transformed in social gospel, is it representative of that social justice tradition, or is it something different altogether? As for how the older churches would have handled it, I'm just not expert enough to say, so I wouldn't venture making a fool of myself on it, especially here where people know something about this stuff. So.
Hello, I'm Dara, and I just had a question related to we talked a lot about property rights, and we've also talked about the original founding fathers and how they definitely came to secure those for a people. I also, though, throughout my studies, thought about how the founding fathers meant to secure against tyranny of a kingship and an oligarchy, and how there are streams of that running within this social gospel that say, you know, that we need to not have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. And I wondered, do you see similarities between the oligarchical structures that manipulated the colonies without representation and actions of corporations within the U.S., such as the Koch industry, which would understandably affect the government through lobbying and other processes without the representation of those people?
Yeah, so let me, I think you're right to point out that during the founding, right, the theory of property rights you get is not the same. They're interested in avoiding an aristocracy or an oligarchy, and it's why you see the rules against primogeniture, things, rules against the sort of vestiges of aristocracy. So they wanted, in other words, to, of course, protect property already held, but also to give you a set of conditions under which the ability to acquire property would be more equally spread, would be more equally open. So it wasn't simply about protecting property already held, right? And so what do you have to do in order to create a system where people can move up the ladder, so to speak, where you can open up opportunity? You need a system of the rule of law. You need a system that enforces private contracts, a system that minimizes governmental interference with private contracts. And so those were seen as a kind of more, if you want to say if the founders had a kind of democratic understanding of property rights, that was a way in which they had a more democratic understanding of property rights. That they wanted to see a system of law which would, where wealth wouldn't be restricted artificially to a certain class, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Now, the second part of your question.
And do you think that that's reflected today amongst, industries that are very concentrated wealth and able to affect Congress and able to affect with lobbying and all these different methods?
Right. I mean, I think the problem there is, because you're making the connection between, say, concentration of wealth in a corporation, let's say, and their ability to influence the public debate. And that then gets you into the First Amendment and into the free speech area. And I mean, I sort of give you a quick and sort of a thumbnail answer on that. It seems to me that when you take a look at the First Amendment, the thing which it is most intended to protect is the ability of people or groups, individually or through concerted effort, to voice their views about government and to protest about government. And in fact, it's sort of ironic that today the First Amendment has sort of been turned upside down, and it's used to protect the kinds of things which certainly the Founding Fathers would have thought to be, reprehensible, obscenity and so on, and where the restrictions that are tolerated are those on the free speech. So, I think they would have been very hesitant to go down the way of restricting free speech by groups, individuals, or anybody, anyone trying to affect the public debate.
So you think money should be used as free speech, or like?
Well,
do you think that comes into this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not quite seeing how you're connecting it up. But if you're asking me, do I believe that it's consistent with the Constitution and with the founders that people should be able to spend as much money as they want to talk about politics? Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
First off, thank you for your presentation. It was great. So you focused a lot on domestic policy and progressives. I was wondering if you could address how religion impacted kind of the establishment of the League of Nations by Woodrow Wilson and the, foreign policy of progressives?
Yeah, I'd put it together with progressivism in general, right? So what you, kind of the connection I'm trying to suggest is that there's a belief there that that God is present in history, that God, history is a providential plan. And so, humanity is moving forward on the basis of this plan. And certainly folks like Wilson and others believe that there were some who were on the advance of this, in the front of this, and others who were further behind. And the idea of the League of Nations, or the idea of sort of progressive internationalism, and I'm sort of grossly generalizing here for the sake of brevity, but the idea of kind of progressive internationalism comes out of this belief that there's a kind of end to history, that there's a certain way forward. And for Wilson, America was or could be, the leader or the beacon in that. And it's funny, a lot of people associate the original idea for the League of Nations with the United Nations, right? To where United Nations today, you have sort of very nations which are not Western and not democratic, on a kind of equal footing with Western democratic nations. Wilson and folks like Wilson would have thought that ridiculous. I mean, Wilson did not conceive of something like the United Nations when he had the League of Nations. What Wilson meant by the League of Nations was Anglo-American leadership. That we were out on the front. We knew where the end of history was. We were going to bring other nations forward. We would point the way. And there was, that was fueled by, at least in Wilson's case, was fueled by a belief that it was the will of God, that this was the plan of providence, and that he understood it, and that he saw it perhaps more clearly than anybody else. If you actually look at quotes of Wilson, during the League campaign, which, as you know, failed, of course, here in the United States. If you look at the quotes, he uses language almost just like what I said. I see the Holy Spirit; it's working through me. People have to recognize this. So, the League of Nations is that whole campaign is actually a good indication of what I'm suggesting about the fusion of one's understanding of God's plan and progressive ideology. So, okay. Yeah, I'll have some water, sure. Do I sound that bad? No.
Not at all. I teach singing, so I'm very aware of the voices, so no, you sound fine.
I won't break out into song then. I'll spare you all that.
I'll give you a lesson later.
I could use one.
Thank you. Does the modern progressive also view him or herself as, or view their relationship with government as being something that is going to be perfected and that people are going to be perfected through time, also the way the early progressives did?
That's a good question.
Or is it close?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think I'm not so sure about that. I think the original progressives were, by and large, true believers.
Mm-hmm.
Modern progressives, I don't know. I think modern progressives certainly want to latch on to the policies or the kind of economic populism of the original progressives. Whether or not it's because they see a kind of, they're sort of true believers in this sort of progressive philosophy of history, I don't know if I would say that exactly. And it's to go back to Dr. Flannery's question to start with. It's why I think you sort of see a kind of splintering of among today's progressives between the sort of religious left and whatever term you want to use for the other side, because I just don't know if there's that true belief in in what's present in historical progress.
Second question. In the face of the tragedies of the 20th century, wherein large government and overwhelming government has led to tremendous death, going from Stalin's purges to his destruction of the people in Ukraine and Georgia, to the fascists and the Nazis and what it brought about.
Does that make you skeptical about the end of history, that we've had progress? I don't understand where you're going.